I recently came back from a trip to Switzerland, that magical little landlocked country in the Alps, and let me tell you, there are some things the Swiss do better than anyone else.
The Swiss cheese fondue.
But another thing I didn't realize they did very well, museums. And we're going to go on a site visit to one of those today, the Laténium, right on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel. Now, first I got to give you a big warning so that you're not under the same misapprehension that I was. You see, this museum may not be quite what you think it is. If you've heard of Tène and are traveling to Neuchâtel just to see this place, chances are you're a big fan of Celtic culture and Celtic history, and that's what you're coming here to see. After all, Tène gives its name to the Second Celtic period, lasting from roughly 450 BC to the Roman conquest of most of northwestern Europe around the year 0. And this period is known for its distinctive artwork with complex intertwining twirly-whirlies and animal motifs. Some of its more recognizable pieces that you may be familiar with are the Gundestrup cauldron, which you can see in the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, the Battersea shield, which you can find in the British Museum in London, and the Argus helmet, which is housed in Angoulême, France. And really, what you find in much of Europe from this period, although actually not that much in Britain, are tons and tons of weapons which were deposited in hoards and watery contexts. So that's probably what you're expecting to find in this museum, a shrine to Celtic culture. Because after all, the museum name, the Laténium, comes from Tène, which is actually the village just down the road. But why is this period named after the village of Tène in Switzerland? Because that's where the type site that gave the era its name is found, in the village of Tène. Now, if you remember from previous episodes, a type site in archaeology or biology is the place where the specimen was found that defined an era or a culture or a creature. So a type site is not the place where the most of something was found or the earliest place it was found. It's simply the place where a specimen was found that was first subjected to rigorous scientific analysis, enough to define a particular type. And in archaeology, that type would be a type of material culture. And what exactly happened at Tène that allowed it to become the type site for Tène Celtic culture? Well, in 1857, and that's really the beginnings of when archaeology began to be considered as an academic discipline, there was a major drought in the area, causing the lake levels to decline precipitously. And just like at Flanfen, this drop in the water level revealed some stakes or piles sticking out of the lake bed. And among these piles, dozens of Celtic-style swords were found. And the site was first published in 1868 by Swiss archaeologist Ferdinand Keller. And as a side note, one of the coolest things you can see in the museum are actual reproductions of original notes and diagrams that you can flip through at your leisure. And then, from 1868 to 1883, the Swiss undertook a major engineering program to permanently lower the levels of water in the lake to allow for more agricultural land and prevent future flooding. And this, of course, revealed tons of archaeology. And at the Tène site alone, the findings included 2 bridges and over 2,500 artifacts, including 166 swords, 270 spearheads, 385 brooches, and 22 shield bosses, and you can see many of these at the museum today. And the fact that there were so many weapons in one place, that the goods were almost exclusively male-gendered, and that many of the swords had never seen any use, led those early researchers to conclude this was some kind of fort or arsenal. However, given all the archaeology that's been done in Europe in the last 160 years, archaeologists now feel pretty confident that this was one of those watery sites, complete with the bridges, where stuff was simply ritualistically deposited. And you can take a drink. But lots of stuff from other eras was also found, ranging from the Paleolithic era through the Romans, medieval times, and even early modern times, and the area became a hot spot for archaeological research. And this is actually what the museum is all about. The layers and layers of history that are discovered in the immediate local area and the archaeological projects that uncovered it. And I'm not going to bury the lead. This is simply the very best museum that I have ever visited that's exclusively dedicated to archaeology. And this is why the museum will not be what you've been expecting if you're coming purely in search of the Celts, which in fact only makes up about 10 to 20% of the exhibit, so you might be disappointed by that. However, if you have a pulse, you will be delighted with the tons of other stuff that you didn't even know was there. Now, not only will you get to see the artifacts and learn the historical background, but the museum presents this in a very engaging way that actually shows the archaeological techniques and, importantly, does not overwhelm you with stuff the way some museums do. To see what I mean, check out the picture of this exhibit in the Laténium on the right versus this other museum on the left, which is another archaeological museum that I've recently visited, which will go unnamed. But if you do know where it is, leave that in the comments section and you will win a fabulous prize. There are so many highlights from this museum, it's difficult to know where to begin. They start off in the photo I showed you, that's the very first room in the museum, by sharing some of the highlights of each age they cover. So the really ancient Paleolithic, the Ice Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman times, and the medieval times. Among these highlights is this awesome quartz crystal arrowhead, an object I've never seen anything like anywhere, and this really well-preserved Celtic gold coin. And remember, gold is soft, so gold coins have a tendency to wear down, and you rarely see early Celtic coins with this level of artistry. And from there are so many objects from different eras which we've actually discussed on this very show. From the Paleolithic, we have one of those bone flutes that I think I discussed in the context of the National Museum of Slovenia, as well as some elements from a Neanderthal skeleton. We also have one of those bones carved with lines that some people consider to be Neanderthal art. We discussed that way back in Archaeology News Edition 8 in the context of that Poland cave. And just like we discussed in that episode, there's a feature about a nearby cave which shows all of those layers of animal bones representing tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, including one of those massive cave bears, as well as some other Neanderthal objects. There's a Bronze Age menhir similar to those we've seen, like those at Karnak, except later, except not at all, because this one is carved with a kind of haunting figure of a man, and it was found when a nearby highway was being built. There's a Roman section, as this was an area of intense Roman settlement. Now, some of the highlights of this are models of a massive nearby villa, as well as a monumental mausoleum. There are also two exquisitely carved busts, though no one is really totally sure who these young ladies that are depicted are.
Is this some kind of bust?
Well, it's very impressive, yes, but we need to ask you a few questions.
But to me, the coolest was the maritime section, which examined in depth the thriving Roman trade along the lake. This part featured in it a large and incredibly preserved Roman ship, as well as two older Iron and Bronze Age canoes. Beyond the boats themselves, which are amazing, this section showcases the care and thoughtfulness put into the museum design and the flow of the exhibit. Now, the excellent audio guide will direct you towards a strategically placed window, and this is not the only part of the exhibit where it does this. Now, when you look out that window, you'll see that part of the lake was actually raised to the level it was at before it was drained in the 19th century. And that will give you a much better view into what the lake actually looked like when this ancient boat right in front of you plied the waters. There's also an explanation and photos of the experimental archaeology that was undertaken to see how this boat was constructed using the exact same type of wood and the tools that would have been available at that time. And it goes even further. The boat that those experimental archaeologists built was actually sunk right outside of the museum in the lake. Now, this was done in part to better understand the formation processes for how that boat was preserved. And you can see it right outside in the archaeological park where the museum is located. Which brings me to that archaeological park outside, because that's a whole different experience. There you'll find experimental archaeological reconstructions of houses that were found in the vicinity from the various different eras, including a really cool part, which is a Paleolithic campsite found nearby that was lifted in full and reassembled there. And there's also those piles from that settlement found in the lake, though to be honest, I'm not sure if they're actually originals like those at Flag Fen, or just sort of a reconstruction to show you how the site appeared when it was first found. And of course, you'll already be familiar with what you're seeing outside in the archaeological park, as long as you've actually toured the inside of the museum first, which does a deep dive into all of these sites.
Gone to 180, 34 years of age, Jeremy Wells!
For example, they show you how the archaeologists figured out how those houses appeared and how they were built based on the archaeological finds, and what those hunter-gatherers at the camp hunted and ate based on the microwear analysis on the stone tools they left behind. And if you want to know more about that subject, check out the ABCs of Archaeology that we delve into microwear analysis. And in case you need a refresher of how well watery context preserves stuff, check out these prehistoric baskets and how exquisitely preserved they are. Honestly, these were some of my favorite artifacts in the museum. And even if you were coming specifically looking for the Celtic stuff, really among all these amazing artifacts, it's almost an afterthought. Pretty much the standard weapons, brooches, and there's also this pretty cool cauldron as well. And again, though this Celtic stuff is impressive, it is somewhat overshadowed by the other exhibits and lacks any really marquee pieces like some of the other finds I mentioned above in museums in France, Germany, Denmark, and the UK. And there you have it, a truly amazing archaeological museum. It's pea-size compared to the Louvre, the Hermitage, the Met, or the British Museum. But the attention to detail focused exclusively on archaeology is unparalleled. And everything from the design of the building itself to the course of the exhibit, which goes back in time, meant to mimic the ways that archaeologists dig through the layers of stratigraphy, well, it all makes for an incredibly immersive experience. And who knew that a relatively small museum in a relatively small country would have such amazing archaeology? And let me tell you, it's not the only one in the country that did. The History Museum in Bern also had an amazing collection, but that'll have to be for another episode. So, if you're in Switzerland, make sure to set aside some of that time you'll be spending skiing or hiking, and make sure to visit Lake Neuchâtel and this amazing museum. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.